should say you are now recording.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that at your end?
Yeah, it says recording.
Okay, great. Okay, well, hello everybody. My name is John Munro, and I teach US history at the University of Birmingham. It's October, which in the UK is officially Black History Month, which we're marking and celebrating here at the University of Birmingham and beyond. But I should really say that October, like February, is one, of course, of the 12 months of the year in which Black history is important and should be studied and talked about. So in any case, I'm really pleased to be speaking today with University of Hertfordshire's history PhD student, Tionne Parris, about her fascinating dissertation, research, and public scholarship on Black radical women in the African-American freedom movement in the 1940s through to the 1960s. So hi, Tionne. Thanks for taking some time to talk to me today.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's exciting to talk about my research.
Great, I'm excited about this too.
Yeah.
So I mentioned just very, very briefly what your kind of topic is, but could you give us a fuller sense of your scholarly work and the project that you're in the early stages of embarking on?
Yeah, so my project is looking at Black radical women in the US, and the women that I'm looking at are typically from sort of pre-1950s. So I'm looking at women from 1930s to 1950s, prior to the sort of Red Scare and a little bit in between that. So I'm looking at women like Claudia Jones, Louise Thompson Patterson, Islanda Robeson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, and all of these women who were, I guess, part of a very dynamic network of activists. There has been a lot written about their activism in general, as far as the organizations they were a part of, but I'm particularly interested in the connections between these women at that time and how they had an impact on the sort of development of the Black Power movement. Because I think the Black Power movement is another historical moment where we see this kind of, I guess, these women who become kind of cultural icons. But not much has been written about the links between these radical women and the ways that they intergenerationally could be connected as far as ideology and the tactics that they used as part of their activism. So my PhD work is kind of interrogating these links. I think historiographically, there's a bit of a gap between the 1950s, 1960s, where we see the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in the later eras. And I just was really interested to kind of figure out whether or not these sort of women appeared out of a vacuum of the civil rights movement, or if there's a long tradition, which of course there is a long tradition of Black radicalism that I believe has impacted the development of the Black Power movement.
Wow. Well, this dissertation is already poised to make some pretty weighty contributions to about Black radicalism. Yeah, no pressure, but nonetheless, that's what I'm hearing and what you're saying about Black radicalism, Black radical women in particular. And again, this sort of trajectory from mid-century and earlier, the 1930s, through to the 1960s and even to the 1970s. And I totally agree. There is this kind of gap sort of, in the 1950s, there is this kind of break. And I feel like there's some good work in terms of some people I've been inspired by who have been trying to think through some of those continuities, but this is obviously going to add another layer to our understanding there as well. So maybe let's get a little deeper into the historiography then. If you can give us a sense a little bit of who are you building on, and whose work has sort of inspired this interpretation that you're putting forward?
So when I first started my research, my sort of entry point was LaShawn Harris's article, Running with the Reds. I was really interested in this phrase that she used where she said that the Communist Party itself was viewed as a vehicle for Black liberation. And having already studied, the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement, I was thinking, so there was already a sort of vehicle prior to this where people had organized around this particular ideology or used these particular tactics to sort of progress their ideas and their movements. So from that article, I was led to Eric McDuffie's book, The Sojourners for Freedom, and Deo F. Gore's Radicalism at the Crossroads. And I really, really enjoyed both of those books. They're very dense studies of particular women as well. A lot of the women don't have biographies, so it's really great to have these sort of two books that kind of intertwine all of their different networks and the women as individuals as well. But again, the thing that I found most interesting, I think, what I thought, maybe I could do something with this, was the fact that both of these books kind of skim over the part between this prior movement and the Black Power movement or the civil rights movement. And I know that a lot of those women were still around at that time. And I guess because of sort of anti-communism and the Red Scare, that's why we don't know as much about them. But for example, I know that Louise Thompson Patterson was part of the Angela Davis campaign. So she was still active and she was still around and connected to these women somehow. So I was really interested to kind of interrogate that gap in the historiography and really add to these really, really great studies that have been done prior to this. Because I think there's a lot more to the story that we can kind of pick away at. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That LaShawn Harris article is great.
Yep.
On the Black radical women in the Communist Party in the 30s, and definitely Eric McDuffie and Diogo Gore's books have really inspired my thinking about this whole era as well. And I just simply agree that, you know, they do such a nice job of trying to think through this this series of decades, and yet also leaving more room for more work to be done in terms of filling that in. So, okay, I have several questions I want to ask you now. So one is, this is hard, and I know that you're in early days in your project, so this will remain to be seen. But how to do it? So if you're thinking about trying to establish a kind of continuity of networks of radical thought, right? So one way is you can track things through publications, but if there's not a lot of publications, then that's something. You can track things through events, perhaps if people are at the same time and place. You can track things through correspondence to some, if people continue to talk to one another, that's something. But I don't know, what do you think might be your kind of mode of just sort of charting these continuities? Because that's the tricky part, right? Or one of the tricky parts.
Yeah, of course, because obviously these women were part of so many different organizations, and they not only worked together, they worked as individuals in different places, different parts of the world as well. So far, where I've started out is looking, first of all, reading the biographies that are available of these individual women. And then from there, kind of interrogating their personal papers. I've looked at Shirley Graham Du Bois's personal papers, for example, because I was really interested in sort of where she ended up after the sort of Red Scare and when everyone sort of dispersed. So far, that's where I've looked. And I found some really interesting things, like her correspondence with people like Robert F. Williams while he's in China, Stokely Carmichael. There's obviously Kwame Nkrumah. So I'm really interested in how these women, even though obviously there's a lot missing, because some of these women didn't even write their own stories. For example, like Claudia Jones never had she never had a chance to finish an autobiography of herself. So I'm really relying on personal papers right now. I think also, as I've said, the two books that I mentioned, they are really good studies of how all these women networked with each other throughout all these organizations. But I find also I have, when I started, I also had a very broad sort of view of the historiography, and I tried not to think, oh, I'm going to look in this book specifically for women. So for example, I looked at the Ben Davis book by Gerald Horne, which is one of my favorites right now. And I kind of just consumed these stories. And from there, I'm thinking, like, for example, Audley Moore appears in there, but I wasn't looking for her. I was just sort of looking for the general feel of the time period. So from that as well, a lot of the previous historiography that isn't focused on the women, but obviously they're there, that is also kind of where I'm trying to establish my sort of view of it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm almost surprised, Tionne, that we've got this far into the conversation without mentioning Gerald Horne yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Influence, you know, going back to that Red and Black book on Du Bois, and ever since, you know, just so many. I mean, he's written about so many other topics as well, but particularly in this area of study, there's, I mean, that he's got to be one of the most influential historians, both in terms of interpretation and volume. It's also interesting because Horne has at times emphasized, I mean, he definitely, you know, obviously sees the continuities, and I learned from him in charting them, but he also has emphasized the break to some degree. And this is another question I have for you. If we think, and this is the basic historian's question of kind of, you know, continuity versus change, if we think about the 1950s as an era of continuity, counter to those earlier interpretations that put it forward as very much a break in terms of this political tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't there a danger in that we may minimize how significant McCarthyism actually was, and the ways that the repressive, white supremacist, reactionary McCarthyite apparatus really did have an impact? So what do you think about that? How do you handle that sort of aspect of the change continuity question?
Mm-hmm. Well, my previous studies, when I did my undergrad and my master's, I was focused on government repression of the Black Panther Party. So I kind of come from this background of really unpicking exactly what it was that these people were facing in terms of government repression. And I think, I would say that I think I do agree it's a continuity. I think where Gerald Horne says, for example, like we have this sort of overall Horne thesis that the civil rights movement kind of pushed away the radicals, and then they were just sort of left out there in the wilderness and didn't have any impact. And I think it's probably it needs to be emphasized that the repression is huge. It's absolutely huge. And I think Gerald Horne's done a great job of obviously highlighting that. And it is really central to what I'm going to be arguing, I think. However, I think it also needs to be emphasized that these women didn't just disappear. They were part of these networks. They remained part of these networks for the rest of their lives, for most of them. And I guess my work is kind of going to fill in that gap of, yes, there was like rampant repression and they had to change their lifestyles. They had to change where they lived. They had to really change massive parts of their life and lost a lot of friends. They lost people. But I think hopefully my study will kind of, I guess, counter the rampant repression with a kind of hopeful, I guess, well, should I say hopeful? Because I think some of it's quite sad the way things ended up. But I guess I want to emphasize that these women weren't stopped, essentially, even though the government tried very, very hard to kind of kick them out or shut them up. These women maintained their activism. They just changed the tactics. And I think when I'm looking at things like the Black Power movement, so much of what these previous women had done is kind of lost. And for the Black Panther Party, for example, I think that if they had been more aware, which hopefully I will find that maybe they were aware, I don't know, but if they were more aware of how these women had previously dealt with the repression, it may have ended up differently. And I think it also would be a really good lesson or a way to unpick how this activism could potentially impact things that are happening now, because there's so much political unrest, and I think there's a lot to be learned from these previous women in the way that they changed their tactics and their ways of protesting.
Yeah, and navigated a period of reaction, a political reaction, right, and persisted in the face of it. Yeah, there's a lot to learn there. From what you're saying. I imagine, like me and like so many others, you're probably also really anticipating Charisse Burton-Stelly's new book when it comes out.
Yes.
She's going to handle these questions, I think, is going to be something that is just going to be something to keep an eye on. And of course, as her work already has taught us, a lot of things. I think this is just going to be that dynamic in particular. It's going to be interesting to see how that comes through. But I think you're so right too, in that, you can show, and that's what's going to be so interesting about your project when you get there, is that it is possible to show the presence of repression and a persistence of a kind of vision, a Black radical vision at the same time. So yeah, let me ask you another question again on the historiography. Is there a historiographical kind of idea or school or even author or two that you're kind of arguing against?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think what immediately comes to my mind, and don't get me wrong, I love the book, I think it's great, was Penny von Eschen's Race Against Empire. There's a part at the end of that where she said in the 1960s, these younger activists had to kind of reinvent the wheel because they didn't have a connection to these previous generations. And I kind of, when I read that line, I was like, I wanna figure out if this is actually true, because I guess my working theory is that they weren't cut off. that a lot of these people like Stokely Carmichael had a direct kind of line to people like Shirley Graham Du Bois, who had lived through repression, had lived through this period of radicalism as well, and became a sort of mentor. So yeah, that was one part where I was like, okay, I think I can kind of interrogate this and hopefully show the opposite.
And that book's had a huge influence on me as well. And exactly in that way, I feel like, there can be books that can be so generative, right? It's not to trash the book to say, I think that there's a different place where this analysis can go. You know what I mean? And so exactly, I think that book, I think it came out in 1997. It opened up so much, following on books like Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe and others sort of through the 1990s, that von Eschen's Race Against Empire just opened up this anti-imperialist kind of politics in such an important way, and then maybe just cut the story short a bit or something in the way that you're describing, leaving open room for others. Like, I feel like, again, Deo Gore and Eric McDuffie also do, they do such important work in showing that repression and the personal consequences of it for the different people that they write about, and this persistence at the same time. So yes, indeed. Great. Well, there's a lot to think through here. Another difficult question that I've been in conversations with people about and thought about quite a bit myself is so on the one hand, there's the kind of like continuity and repression question, and trying to sort of get that right. A very different question is the question of Stalinism when you're talking about the Communist Party. So, on the one, I mean, there's the kind of caricatured versions. There's the caricatured version which sort of portrays the Communist Party as this force entirely for liberation. And many people made incredible use of it, obviously, in very difficult circumstances toward those ends. Then you have another view, and politically somewhere else, which says this organization served a deeply undemocratic, to put it one way, regime in the Soviet Union. And that the kind of repressive political culture of the Soviet Union was replicated in communist parties around the world, such as the Communist Party of the United States. So how do you negotiate the question of Stalinism when thinking about Black radicalism and anti-racism in the post-war period?
Yeah, it's tricky, I think. So far, I've really tried to kind of ground myself with that sort of topic, because I'm not a historian of communism at all in any way. So I guess my perception at this stage, which I guess is quite early, was again just this idea that the Communist Party was a vehicle for Black radicals, and I have come across critiques, or these activists facing critiques of, well, why didn't you speak out against what was happening? And a lot of them said, well, we just thought it was part of anti-communist propaganda. And I guess on the other hand as well, it's like, well, we're having a bad time here, we're focused on here. And I guess whilst the Communist Party was a vehicle for them, it wasn't the only vehicle as well. When I think of like Louise Thompson Patterson and her work outside of the Communist Party, I guess these radicals were just using any means possible. And I think the sort of communist ideology was useful, but a lot of them moved on from that. If you think of like Audley Moore as well, she said that the Communist Party was her kind of training in activism, but obviously her ideology changed after she left. So I do think my view of it right now is that the Communist Party obviously had a lot of issues, but at the time for these radicals, it was a means to an end. And then they obviously evolved, moved on from it.
Yeah, that's so well said. And, just listening to you talking about that also is useful for me in thinking about sometimes the question of Stalinism can be like it's important, it's worth thinking about. And obviously the one thing I will disagree with you, Tionne, you are a historian of communism among others here. So I'll disagree with you there. But one thing to be said is there's a way in which that question can overwhelm everything else, or can attempt to overwhelm or even derail. Because now this is entirely a conversation about the relationship between the CPUSA and the Soviet Union. And actually the point you're making is the much more fundamental one. What were Black radical women doing in terms of making use of this kind of political apparatus to further gains of liberation, right? Which if it wasn't the CPUSA, it might have been something else. And with somebody like Audley Moore, you've got a perfect example of someone who does make use, and many others who make use of various organizations. So I feel like that's really useful for me to think through too, because sometimes it's like you can think about the question of Stalinism a lot, and it does compel our attention, but there's almost a way in which it can distract from the issue at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I found as well at this very sort of early stage, I was thinking like, how much of like actual, communist ideology or literature do I need to pour through to kind of understand this time period? And I was advised by my supervisor, Tony Shaw, like, don't get bogged down because it's a mess out there. The kind of arguments that historians get in about different factions of communist ideology and which one was more effective. And yeah, so my focus is mainly just on these women and how they thought, maybe not so much as the larger structure of the Communist Party and the way things kind of went with that.
Some good advice from Dr. Shaw there. That's good to hear, because I think that's very sound. And again, there's also this way that, it becomes, if your own analysis is not sufficiently anti-Stalinist, then and it may never meet that test to the satisfaction of some other scholars or whatever, just move on. I feel like for me on that question, I had the very good fortune of being able to interview and speak with Jack O'Dell and with Esther Cooper Jackson, and to get to ask them like very directly, because I also feel like for that generation coming through, so much repression around this question of, are you a communist or have you ever been, and so on. I feel like it was also kind of difficult to talk about to some degree publicly, whereas in a private conversation, it was a little bit more like, okay, like, this is not why we were there, was kind of the message that I often got in these discussions. And exactly the point that you've already said, that this was a kind of means to an end of a broader end of Black freedom that would also mean a better society for everybody. And so the Communist Party was important, again, to use your term, vehicle for this. So
yeah,
it's also really interesting to talk to you about this, because this is where the scholarship is going in terms of this dissertation you'll be working on. And it's kind of nice for me to think about like, oh, the question of Stalinism is not going to bog down emerging upcoming scholars in this field as much as it might have people like me. So this is also welcome news. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and let me ask you, how did you get interested in this topic? What was your route to working on Black radical women in the mid-20th century United States?
Well, as I said before, my sort of entry point was the Black Panther Party. But I guess prior to that, I grew up in Scotland with my white family, and as a result, I was, as a child, like really encouraged to I guess explore my African American side and the history there. And when I think I was like 13, my mom bought me a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography. And that's kind of my origin story, because from there I think because I was exposed to Malcolm X first, if that makes sense. Like I knew of Martin Luther King, but I hadn't read anything about him. Because I started with Malcolm X, it kind of led me down this path of radicals. So by the time I was at university, I was like, I want to study not the civil rights movement, but the Black Power movement, because that, I guess, resonated more with me. I guess as a teenager as well, you just want to learn about the radicals and what seems like the cool group. But I definitely, that was kind of where I started. And then throughout my undergraduate and master's, I was looking at repression, as I said. And particularly in my master's thesis, I was looking at the way that the Black Power movement intersected with prison abolitionist movement. And then that got me thinking more and more about this idea of prisoners and political prisoners, and how that kind of became a way to silence or kind of exile political activists within the country as well. And especially Angela Davis's trial, that really resonated with me as well. So when I was thinking of the ways in which the government had sort of used political prisoners to that end, I thought, well, there has to be more to this. This kind of just started in the 1960s and 70s. Because obviously COINTELPRO is this huge sort of spider network of repression. And I figured it can't have just started there. So again, when I sort of looked back a little bit, I kind of had this working thesis or hypothesis that You know, the first sort of McCarthy trials and stuff was just like a test run for the COINTELPRO program that really expands later on. And these earlier radicals are kind of the precursor to this sort of rampant repression and mass incarceration and stuff, where political activists and their ideals are kind of shut down very quickly and efficiently by the US government, because obviously it challenges the status quo. And I think of women like Claudia Jones, and she was really such a threat. And I guess I kind of want to argue that that's where this sort of this systematic shutdown of left-wing radicals has started, and where it sort of leads.
Wow, that's so many interesting things there, and just, you know, again, the way that Malcolm X's autobiography can open a world, right? There's just so much in there, and it's just such a compelling read, and is for so many people. But I also think you make I just want to emphasize a point you make here. We were talking about continuity of kind of subversive continuities earlier. I think you also make a really good point here about the continuities of repression itself. When we think about COINTELPRO, first thing that comes to mind for me is usually the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement, you know, late 60s, early 70s type of formations. But of course, it has where does it come from? It comes from the McCarthy period. And so there's a way that your work can also teach us something about the continuities of repression, as well as the continuities of resistance. So let me ask you a little bit more about yourself here, in terms of, it's interesting for me, I mentioned this to you before, that I'm from Canada, but I was actually born in Scotland and come from a Scottish family myself. And I'm interested in thinking about questions of kind of race and imperialism and anti-racism from a Scottish frame. And now you're doing your PhD at an English university, so there's also those differences within the UK. You know, there's always questions in Scotland about kind of colonialism in different ways. Sometimes, you know, about what England has, the ways that England has been a colonial power vis-a-vis Scotland, maybe less so about the ways that Scottish people participated in the British Empire. So is there a kind of Scottish angle of vision on this topic?
I mean, I can't speak directly to the sort of I guess institutional responses to it, but I guess the vibe of Scotland really is quite progressive. I won't get into politics that much, but I do think that Scotland, in a way, because it kind of has this history, or this perception of history as being a country which has sort of faced a lot of, I guess, repression. I don't know if that's the right word, but they definitely have this idea of trying to liberate themselves from England. And I guess in a way you could think of it as being like an internal kind of colony. That's maybe the way that more broadly Scottish politics kind of ends up viewing itself. But I think my experience in Scotland was it was interesting. At least I think my experience, people were very open to talking about race, or at least in the schools that I was in. I went to university in Dundee, and I remember in one of my English literature classes, we were looking at the Joseph Knight book, which is about essentially a slave in Scotland who is trying to win his freedom and argue that he should be allowed to be free. And that was my first kind of, it's strange, it was my first sort of introduction to the idea that there were slaves in Scotland at all. I think it's kind of two-sided in that Scotland is very progressive, very anti-racist, sort of anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia. Like all these things are part of like public campaigns. We have like posters around where we're very upfront about, no, this is not the place to do this. But at the same time, there kind of needs to be, I think, more of an institutional focus on, I guess, the darker parts of Scotland's history, and the fact that even though we are a very progressive country and it's a good place to be, generally, but I'm biased. It definitely could do a bit more to be more honest about its history. And I think England kind of has the flip side, where England just completely blocks its ears and closes its eyes and says, we're not going to talk about this. I don't know if you saw Boris Johnson's recent conference chat where he talked about how English history is being attacked and they're trying to edit it, and they're trying to say Churchill was a racist. It's interesting how I guess flagrant these ideas are in England versus in Scotland. If you said this kind of thing, you might get someone might stop you and say, wait a minute, we don't talk about this way. Yeah.
So interesting. but it does also seem to me, again, from a distance, that the Scottish national conversation is, doesn't definitely need to go farther, and there needs to be a reckoning with, Scottish whiteness, Scottish participation in the British Empire, racism in Scotland, and, the relationship between Scotland and slavery. And so it's also interesting to think about the ways that these histories of Black radicalism in the US can, connect in different and maybe surprising ways to a national conversation about race and racism in a place like Scotland,
Yeah, I'm actually it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things I've been thinking of in the last couple of weeks, I've obviously been looking at Paul Robeson and Islander Robeson, and I've been thinking a lot about their time in the UK, the way that Paul Robeson really connected with working class people in the UK, especially like Welsh miners, for example. And I feel like some really great work could be done, kind of analysing how, this country, or Scotland and the rest of the UK at least, managed to really kind of rally around this man who was an outspoken, I guess, civil rights activist, who was very radical, and the way, I guess, the relationship between that and where it's kind of gone. I had a conversation with Paul Simpson, who I did a podcast with about Islander Robeson, and we unfortunately didn't record this section of our conversation, but it was really great because we were talking about how, I guess, his grandfather's generation, his uncle, they all remember Paul Robeson in the UK, and they say, "Oh yeah, it's the guy who used to sing and he used to go on tours, and we loved him here." And then, like, his mother's generation they've heard the name, but they don't really know much about him. And I guess my generation, I didn't know anything about him when I entered the study. And I think there's something really interesting to sort of poke at there. And I guess we hypothesized that maybe it's because obviously the Red Scare and the sort of loss of Paul Robeson's celebrity could be why that dissipated so much in the UK. But the fact there's such a strong reaction amongst these earlier generations who remember Paul Robeson, I think that's a really interesting thing that could be investigated in the UK.
Very much so. And what an illustration of the point we were talking about earlier of the continuities. There is this kind of memory of Paul Robeson in the UK, but also the power of repression. Simply the act of taking away his passport meant he couldn't physically come to the UK. And so that was a real way of kind of breaking that continuity as well. So yeah, there's a lot more to, well, that will be interesting, the degree to which, I don't think doesn't seem like that's your central question at the moment, but it's also just a very interesting one to keep thinking with.
Yeah.
So let me ask you another question. So, how did this conversation between us come to be? I saw you tweeting about the magazine Freedom, and I just thought, oh, wow, there's a PhD student who's working on this. This is very interesting. So one of the things I was hoping we could do in this conversation is to tell our listeners about Freedom. It's one of those publications, it seems to me, that, in some circles, people know what it is, and in many other circles, they don't. So do you want to maybe say a little bit about this magazine, maybe why you're tweeting about it, why you think it's important, why does it matter?
Yeah, so I arrived at Freedom when I was kind of trying to think about what kind of archives I wanted to use for my studies. And one of the questions I was thinking about was really, what have these Black radical women written about? So I was looking at people like Claudia Jones and her, the way she'd written in the Daily Worker, for example. And then I sort of stumbled upon the Freedom Archive, which is online and available, digitized. And so I was initially picking through it, knowing, oh, this is a newspaper that a lot of Black people are contributing to, and they're in the time period that I'm in, so it might be worth picking through and see whose names I can recognize. And then I found, as I got deeper and deeper into them, that I wasn't just interested in seeing what the women had written. I was really interested in the sort of conversations that were being had in this newspaper. And I mean, it ran from 1951 to 55. So it's quite short in terms of, its run. And I guess it was impacted by McCarthyism. But as I picked through it, I realized it was something so interesting to me that these radicals were writing about things and I guess pointing out so many like flaws with the US and colonialism across the world, and these other issues of the time that seem huge now, and I can't imagine seeing it in newspapers the way they'd written today. And I was just blown away. I mean, I get very excited when I talk about it because it's just such an interesting an interesting newspaper. I felt the need to share it with people on Twitter, because the more I was reading, the more I was thinking, like, does anyone know this is here? And even when I was coming across, like, for example, poems from Langston Hughes, I just felt like I needed to share these things, and like Alice Childress parts as well, where she's writing from the perspective of this domestic sort of Black woman laborer. I was really, really interested in sort of sharing that with the internet, because I felt like this is probably something that people would A, be interested in, and B, should be interested in, because again, it's that idea of a lot of the issues that, you know, we're thinking about today, I guess, when we think about anti-colonialism and like arguments about politics and things, like these were front page of this newspaper. And it's the same issues as well that just keep coming up. For example, if you think about Palestine, like they're talking about this stuff in the 1950s, and they have the same ideas that we had, or we have now, but we obviously haven't really made the connection that this has been said before. So that, I guess, from like a, you know, 25-year-old perspective, I was like, I got to share this with people, because obviously we are talking about politics every day, and yeah, it's all been written before.
Yeah, I feel like Lorraine Hansberry's columns in Freedom, like the analysis has not been surpassed. You know, it's like there are other very good analyses of all kinds written then and since, but I mean, you will find some of the sharpest writing you can find on questions on questions exactly as you say, of our moment as well as of theirs: race, imperialism, the relationship between gender and capitalism, etc. There's so much in there. So that's great. Thank you. I think it's also, I totally agree that this is a magazine that's really, you know, the more people know about, the better. And then there's that interesting trajectory too of how the Freedom Group, or at least, you know, several of them reconstitute around Freedom Ways, which began in the 1960s, and that goes all the way to the 1980s. So then you have that kind of longer. So you do have McCarthy repression kind of bringing that magazine to an end, but then a friend of mine, Ian Roxborough Smith, has written specifically on this connection between the two magazines, the ways that the second one continues in many ways the work of the first, which also brings us right into the era that you're also so interested in. Into that era and even beyond, that you're interested in connecting here. Okay, great. So a couple more questions. I feel like this conversation could go for a long time. Too much longer. I did notice, and I want to call anyone who's listening's attention to your article in U.S. Studies Online about critical race theory. And you know, it's just a great example of how your research again connects to the politics of the present. Do you want to say a little bit about this article, if you would?
Yeah, of course. So I had originally written a few articles for USSO on the alt-right, because it's a bit of my hobby interest to sort of figure out what the other side are up to, if that makes sense. I like to kind of be aware of what kind of propaganda is going around, and critical race theory is one that just kept popping up. And obviously I know in the US it's a big deal. It's getting a lot of coverage. It kind of is being used as a boogeyman, I think. And I had this discussion last night, actually, where I was saying it's similar to a lot of the same arguments that you see in the 1950s, this idea of, oh, well, if we include other races of people into our curriculums or into our neighborhoods or everything else, we're going to lose something. It's going to take something away from us. And really the thing that is that they're trying to hold on to is this sort of superiority and this sort of gains that they have over minorities. And I think critical race theory is the same idea that just keeps being recycled over and over again with a different name. So when I was thinking about critical race theory, I was thinking, I've seen this somewhere before. And I think part of the problem in placing critical race theory at this current time is that a lot of people don't have the background knowledge of, you know, anti-communism, which is all it is, really. Or at least that's my argument. It's this it's kind of this phrase or this idea that really prompts a knee-jerk reaction against people who want, I guess that's the thing as well. I feel like the things that people are talking about in the US are not radical by any means. They're things that I guess should be the norm, but the fact that anti-communism has such a chokehold on the US means that they are just so against any sort of changes. And I was thinking as well about women like Claudia Jones, who in her trial in the 1950s was saying very clearly that, oh, you guys aren't worried about the KKK, you're not worried about fascists, but you're worried about anti-fascists and you're worried about communists. Why is that? And I guess I really wanted to make that connection between these current times and the past, and that, yeah, this is all just to do with anti-communism, and it's all just to do with kind of shutting down and shouting back at people who are asking for change.
Let me cite you as my source right now, because in future conversations on critical race theory, I will be simply saying it's just simply anti-communism, you know,
Yeah.
because I feel like that is really, in a nutshell, kind of what it is, and where it certainly comes from. And exactly, you know, this is a really good example of just the good work that historians can do in that sense, in explaining a public, you know, discussion, controversy, what paranoia, what have you, by looking, and the inability for us to get a full sense of what it's about unless we kind of see where it came from. And anti-communism is key here. Whereas for some people, anti-communism, I'd be like, what does that even have to do with this, right? But you explained it so well. The connection is direct, and you also, again, people should check out your article here, because it's brief and it makes those connections very strong there.
Thank you.
So you're also part of the Young Historians Project. I need to ask you to tell us, if you will, a little bit about that too, because that's such an important initiative in this country.
I'd love to. So I joined the Young Historians Project at the beginning of the year, actually. And my reasoning for joining was, when I was at university in Scotland, I always felt quite isolated in my history classes, because not just because we don't really cover much Black history other than, you know, the civil rights movement. And that says a lot, because we're in Britain as well. Like, we're not talking about Black British history at all. And I also was usually the only Black person or person of color in the class. Now that is, I guess, maybe just the area I was in, but when I joined YHP and looked them up, they actually had posted some statistics on the sort of state of Black British historians in the UK. And there was the Broken Pipeline report of 2019, which found that between 2017 and 2018, only 3% of PhD students who were in their first year were Black. And YHP really exists to, I guess, counter this. And they are really trying to interrogate why that is the case in the UK. And I guess some of the conclusions they came to were, people just aren't interested. Black children aren't interested in their own history because we're not talking about their history in classes. We're not talking about people that look like them, or, you know, their grandparents' kind of history. We're kind of putting that under the rug, and we're just going to talk about the World War, and we'll just move on from there. So it's about creating resources to represent Black history, first and foremost, but also it's made up of volunteers who are, you know, also young Black people who are interested in history. So it helps them develop skills through this volunteer work, and they produce resources like documentaries. They do workshops in classes. They do so much. Podcasts, ebooks. We just launched our African Women in the NHS project, which was kind of looking at the history of African women in the NHS between the 1930s and 2000s, because I think at this particular moment in British history, there is a certain vibe around, you know, immigration and a race specifically in the UK. And so this project was really kind of unpicking these stories, and also putting these stories together through interviewing these women who had come in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and have really contributed a lot to the country, but don't get much representation when we look at history in Britain. So projects like that really are aimed at, again, just having representation, showing that this history is here. Black people have been in the UK for a very long time, and there's also so much of Black history that hasn't really been addressed as well, which I think has led to this kind of moment in the UK in terms of politics, where we don't really know our history fully, and there's a reason for that. There's a point for that. So yeah, the YHP is great, and that it's, for me as a historian, it's a way for me to connect with other Black historians, which are kind of scarce in this country. But it's also a way that I can sort of contribute to growing this field of Black British history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. It's such important work in so many levels, right? Back to the high schools, even primary schools, and through the entirety of the educational apparatus, the way it speaks to contemporary politics, the research that you all are doing. I mean, it's just like, it's incredible. So I'm glad thank you for telling anyone who's listening about this as well.
Yeah.
That's another very much something that the more people know about, the better. And exactly, to speak to the dismal state of affairs in terms of who is represented in workplaces like the university work, you know, for instance. So yeah. You're busy with all of these things,
Okay.
writing this amazing dissertation, doing all this other work. So I guess all that's left for me to do is thank you. It's just so nice to talk to you and learn more about your work. And now anyone else who hears this will, like me, be looking very forward to seeing where your research goes. And it's also nice because as a public scholar, we'll wait for the dissertation. Okay, yeah, keep working on that, please.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's also nice that there'll be, shorter intervention. I imagine we'll be seeing more shorter interventions from you in the public discourse as well. So
I hope so.
yeah, that's great. Well, again, Tionne, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you. It's really great to speak to someone about my research as well.
Great. Let me stop the recording here.